Mabuhay, and welcome to Rural Art Connection, the place where your boredom ends and your creativity begins.
Shut up and sit down.
Back in high school, either in 9th or 10th grade, my life was affected drastically. Working at Wendy's had me coming home at midnight, even during school nights. My parents didn't like that much, but money was on my mind. I was driving an old '69 Camaro, so my money was being dumped into fixing it up. I wasn't necessarily the perfect child that I portrayed in my small town in Texas. I mean, I wasn't getting arrested, but I was a little mischievous. I wasn't necessarily heading down the right path. Since I worked late hours, and I came and went as I pleased, I told my parents I was working late and I should be home around midnight. I went into work at 5 and got off at 9, then headed to my girlfriend's house, which was a town over. When I arrived at her house, I killed the engine and I walked up to her house to ring the doorbell. Before I begin with the unusual situation, let me explain two important big details. My '69 Camaro had issues, like any other classic, but mine was loud. It had a 350 short block with an Edelbrock exhaust, bad brakes, a heavy full metal body that creaked, and drove with bad handling. The second important detail is, Tina, my girlfriend, lived on a long stretch of road surrounded by huge pecan and oak trees that kept her house and street covered in darkness, even during the day. She comes to the door and tells me that we have to hang out in the front yard on the patio, but instead, we headed to my car and her parents were usually asleep by then, and grabbing on some food I stole from work, we chatted up and began fooling around. By then it was 11, so I knew I would have to be leaving soon. I walk around to the rear of the car to open her door, which is difficult to open because it's usually jammed, when I noticed an eerie stillness. While being freaked out and fighting with the passenger handle, I look towards the neighbor's mailbox. I then hear whistling. I could feel that someone was watching me. Tina manages to force the door open by kicking it, hitting me in the stomach, and notices me looking over and searching for the whistling. She heard it too. She freaked out and started crying. The neighbor's huge tree began shaking. Branches began to crack and drop from above. I tell her to jump back in the car, and I too run to the front of the car to get back in. As I slammed my door shut, I looked over at Tina, and she was gone. She hightailed it back to her front door. I could see her face, and it freaked me out when she began pointing at her neighbor's tree from her window. Being slightly in a daze, I look in my rearview mirror instead of putting the keys in the ignition. I noticed leaves were falling all around my car. Oddly, there was no wind, and no other trees that were swaying, only the ones near my car. I start my car, and look towards Tina at the window again. Now she was jumping, and I guess screaming, so I throw it in the drive and go, but wanted to know what I was experiencing, so I stopped a couple of houses down. Again, I looked back in my rearview mirror, but this time I saw two glowing eyes, huge orange-red eyes. In my mind, I was thinking it's an owl, but then noticed my brake lights lit up behind me, capturing an outline of a mammoth creature. I now could see what it was, like it was saying, "Notice me." This was no owl. I hit the gas down the long stretched road and focused on my mirrors. This creature was following me. This thing was causing so much destruction in those trees. It followed me flying tree to tree, knocking more tree limbs down to the road. It was like I was in a trance. I couldn't keep my eyes off of her. Yes, her. This thing was a her, with wings like a bird, but bony in a sense that you could see the bone structure like a bat, and a normal-sized female figure, but with long claws where her feet should be. The wingspan was no less than 10 feet in length. The body looked like dark skin, but had no clothing, and shoulder-length hair with huge piercing eyes. I can't describe the face in detail. It was like in the dramatic movies where you see the character's eyes, and the rest of the face is drowned in shadow. I finally hit Interstate 35, but couldn't see it anymore. There were too many other cars around. After running several lights and missing a couple of stop signs, I pulled up to my driveway. I kicked the door. I'm not even sure I turned the car off, and ran inside straight to my room. "You're finally home?" I hear from my parents' room. But I just slammed the door and killed the lights in my bedroom. I was safe indoors, where no one could see or hurt me. I laid in bed shaking, trying to figure out what just happened. Then something hits my window. Thinking it was my dog Killer, I turn my lights on and I look outside. Then I remember he was inside of his crate. We had a tall crepe myrtle right outside my bedroom window facing the backyard. I put two and two together and killed the lights again, wishing I had curtains or even blinds. I hid right up against the wall next to the window. This thing had followed me all the way home and was outside of my window, perched in a tree. I was trying to yell for my parents, but didn't want to give away my location to this thing. Then this high-pitched whistle/scream comes out, and something hit my window and is scratching the window pane. It sounded like razors being used to scrape against it. The scraping continued until my mother burst in yelling, "What the hell are you doing whistling?" At this point, I was balled up crying against the wall. I remember later, she said I appeared as if I had lost all color, almost white, and I'm Latino. So I explained the night, what happened and what I had witnessed. She tacked up an old bedsheet over the window. Half an hour later, my grandmother walks in, and she asks what I saw. Growing up, all of us grandkids were told crazy stories by our mothers and grandmothers. We thought they were to keep us scared and in line. I explained once more, and she cried along with my mother. She told me that this thing was a witch, half bird and half lady, and they called her Lechuza a bruja, and apparently it would watch for bad souls and abduct you by whistling at night. Once I was calm, she performed some Mexican ritual on me and spent several minutes praying over me, and finally, I felt somewhat at ease. "Now you act right and be respectful, stupid," my grandma yells. The next day, my mother had a crew come and remove the tree, and bought new blinds and thick dark curtains. This was the last day that I would act like a fool. I'm now 36 years old, married, not to Tina, have a small family, and my parents moved from that location and are now building their new home on my land. Life is great besides a couple of odd things that have happened throughout the years, but nothing compared to Lechuza. This was real, and they weren't just stories. I have heard many stories about skinwalkers and various other mythical creatures, so I thought I would share a story of something that is commonly known in southern states as La Lechuza. From what I have heard, they are in southern Texas, New Mexico, and northern Mexico, but they could be at other locations. I know that they are supposed to be witches disguised as owls, except for the fact that they are freakishly large, and are obviously not owls because they have human faces. A little bit of a backstory before I provide my personal story. We have all heard the tales growing up, but no one ever believes it. From what I know, they only come out at night and when you are alone or in a small group, mainly when you are the most vulnerable. They are said to hum in an almost humanly way, almost like a whistle. It's a truly creepy sounding hum, and you must never mock it in any way. In the stories, they come as omens of death or curses, or they're simply trying to kidnap kids. Now on to the story. This all happened back in 2003, when I was approximately 16. My name is Jessica, and I was extremely petite at the time, weighing 95 pounds soaking wet. I lived in a small city in West Texas. I was dropping off my friend David at his house in a relatively small suburban community. David was about 5'6" and weighed about 125 pounds. We were about the same age, and neither of us could really fight anything off if we were attacked. David's neighborhood wasn't necessarily in the middle of nowhere. It was actually right by the college, but it was very dimly lit, almost completely pitch black. It was approximately 11 o'clock at night. I was in the driver's seat saying my goodbyes and laughing at some stupid joke David had made, when in my rearview mirror, out of my peripheral vision, I saw something white go by. It went by so quickly, and it was so dimly lit outside, that I thought I might have imagined it. So when I turned around to look and see if anything was behind the car, and saw nothing, I figured it was just my imagination. I turned to face David, and he, of course, was looking at me in a confused way, almost like he was asking, "What's wrong?" I was about to tell him I thought I saw something, when we both saw something shoot by the front of the vehicle just as quickly. Now we're both sitting there with confused looks on our faces, wondering what the hell we just saw. A possible Lechuza sighting hadn't even crossed my mind. I was still trying to process what was going on when we both heard the distant whistling of a human that was slightly distorted. It was coming from the front of the car off in the distance. Then we heard another one coming from behind the car, and one to the left of the car, and one to the right of the car, all out of eyesight. I quickly looked around to see if I could find anything that was making that noise, and I saw what looked like a statue on one of the roofs of a house that was 2 houses down from our location. Confused, I turned to David and asked if his neighbor had a note on his roof. He looked at me confused and answered no. We both looked at this strange creature that was just chilling on his neighbor's roof. Then we started to notice its features. It had to be about 4 feet tall. There was no way it was any smaller. It was right next to the chimney, and it was almost the same height. It looked like a damn bird, but it was too dark to tell what kind of bird. And even at the distance we were, it was obvious it had an orange-red set of glowing eyes. We were obviously freaked out by the sight of this thing, especially when a vehicle drove by, and we saw this damn thing move a few feet over to avoid getting hit by the headlights. And as soon as the car had passed, actually stepped back to its original spot. That was the last straw. I peeled out, and David was stuck in my car until I felt safe. We drove around for an hour hoping that things would leave. I went back to his house, but this time I dropped him off in the alley behind his house. We weren't sure if those things had left, so he ran inside and sent me a message letting me know he was safe. It's not like we could have called the police and reported a giant bird on people's houses, or called anyone for help. Who would believe us? We knew what it was, because I had heard the legends, and while we were driving around for that hour, I had relayed information to David, who was confused and freaked out. I drove home and hoped that was the last of it, but of course, it never is. Later on at school, David had informed us that all night he had heard the scratches on his windows and light tapping noises. This seemed to be the only time he heard them, but I told him to be careful just in case they came back. My friends and relatives have encountered these Lechuzas as well. I do know for certain what I saw, and birds aren't supposed to be that damn big, and they sure as hell aren't supposed to have glowing eyes. I didn't drink or do drugs, and neither did David, so we were both sober and clear-minded. I know too many people that have seen these things, so something's going on, and if you just Google it, you can read more stories. My name is Aaron, and this story is told from my grandma's perspective. This happened right after my grandma had bought the house that she currently lives in. She was so excited, and to celebrate, she invited her boyfriend and a couple who were good friends. I can't remember the woman's name, but it was something along the lines of Kathy, so I'll call her that. My grandma, Carol, and Kathy went downstairs to put up curtains, while the guys went out to buy champagne for the celebration. Let me give you the layout of the house. When you walk in the front door, you're essentially on the second floor, because the house was built on a hill. The bottom floor is the den where they were putting up the curtains on the living room, which faced her pool. On the third floor is where the bedrooms are, and the fourth is where the game room and 2 balconies are, one facing the front, then one facing the back. It was around 8 p.m. when the guys left, and my grandma and Kathy were in the den on the first floor. They were going through old movie boxes, when Kathy walked over to my grandma and put her hand on her shoulder and asked her if she was crying. When my grandma looked up at her, Kathy was confused because my grandma clearly was not crying. She replied, "No, what the hell?" And they laughed. Kathy was left with a look of confusion and stopped and looked around. My grandma was about to ask her why, but Kathy shushed her. They both listened, and she said it sounded like a faint crying, but also a low, wretched screaming, which, if you ask me, just imagining it sounds terrifying. They made their way upstairs to the kitchen on the second floor and listened. She said it was even fainter, like they were closer to it when they were in the den. They soon figured out it was coming from the backyard. My grandma, being a police officer, honestly isn't scared of anything. She decided she wanted to go out on the porch and see if she could make out the sound. Kathy was freaking out and held on to my grandma like you would a friend while walking through a haunted house. Kathy whined, "Carol, you don't know what's out there. Just wait till the boys get back. They can deal with whatever it is. It sounds ugly." My grandma laughed and said, "I'm not waiting for anybody. I can handle myself." She proceeded to open the back door to the porch. She walked out, and it was dark other than the pool light. She looked to her right and slowly scanned the areas, turning her head to the left. Then she saw something odd. There was a big black thing at the bottom of the stairs on the railing which leads to the pool. She walked out farther to see what it was. She said the noise got louder, crying, growling, and screaming, all at once. And then it stopped. The thing slowly turned its huge head to reveal what looked like a woman with long black hair, but morphed with an owl. She said it was so big she couldn't believe the railing was holding it up. What shocked me was that she said when she was staring at it, and it stared back, she was not afraid, but more curious as to why it was on her property. She wasn't mad either, just pure curiosity. She heard Kathy bolt back inside. My grandma stood her ground and just stared at this creature. She said it didn't look angry or even have a menacing stare. It looked sad, but at the same time almost emotionless. Then she said the owl lady slowly turned its head back to its original position and spread its enormous wings, about the length of a car, and flew away into the night. She also said that she couldn't hear its wings when it flew, which was all the more curious to me. I wondered why this Lechuza was there. My grandma later told me she used to be what is called a white witch and practice witchcraft, and that it's said that people who do these things have a sort of guardian. Not an angel, but creatures, like the one she saw. She said she guessed that's why it was there. She also told me she had seen it 2 more times after that. Once before her son passed away, my father, and another when a close friend also passed. I find it scary, yet interesting.
So if you like this video, go ahead and tap that subscribe button, hit that like, and I'll catch you in the next one.